Hall Foster Bill.
Tēnā koe e te mana whakawā. Sir, just before I address the issue at hand, the Environmental Reporting Bill in this second reading debate, I'd like to add my voice to the congratulations that have already been offered in this House for Mr David Wilson, who's taking up the position of Clerk of the House. Last week I travelled to Kota Kinabalu, Sabah State in Malaysia, and to attend a Commonwealth Parliamentary Association conference. And one of the focuses there was the importance of the role of the clerk in good governance and transparency in a democracy such as ours. So well done to Mr Wilson for taking on that very important position. So turning to the matter at hand, sir, the Environmental Reporting Bill. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate the Minister, Dr Nick Smith. The Honourable Dr Smith has been a long-standing and very passionate advocate for the environment, for conserving our endangered species, and in fact all New Zealand Indigenous species, and for advancing sensible and pragmatic policies which both allow us to continue to have economic growth and a robust economy in New Zealand to provide for those goods and services and lifestyle that we would like to have as a country, whilst balancing that against the need to make sure we have clean air and water and sensible regulations in place to protect species and that environmental lifestyle that we also value here in New Zealand. So, sir, as part of that legacy that Dr Smith has, this bill fits in perfectly. It is a very credible piece of legislation to bring us in line with the majority of other OECD countries which have some form of environmental reporting regime. So I have to say, sitting on this side of the House and hearing some of the previous contributions from the opposition, it is with a sense of irony. In fact, it is a little bit rich to hear that this is an inadequate measure, given in 9 years of the previous government nothing was done to advance an environmental reporting regime of this nature. Similarly, sir, we've had many comparisons made so far in this debate between environmental reporting and financial reporting, which was implemented in the late 80s, in fact early 90s, to ensure that we didn't have another situation whereby the population of New Zealand were misled as to the finances of the country going into an election. I think that is a very valid comparison to make. And if the members across were serious in their concerns about aspects of this legislation, they would note that the legislation in the financial area does provide exactly the same degree of independence for officials in terms of what is chosen to be reported on in that area. It wouldn't be useful or helpful for the people of New Zealand or for members of this House or for the functioning of our democracy, for instance, if Treasury or the Reserve Bank or other financial agencies of state were to branch off into weird and wonderful and bizarre areas of financial academic interest and report those at great expense to the taxpayer, rather than those core pieces of important information that the people of New Zealand need to know. And similarly, sir, it would be equally strange to empower officials to be making expensive decisions around what areas of the environment should be reported on, when this piece of legislation contains very clear guidance. And I have read the bill, Dr Woods, and you may interject across the House with the regularity of the world's most tedious metronome, but I'm here to say that we have in the bill very clearly laid out the 5 domains that the public of New Zealand need to know about, that certainly members on this side of the House are interested in. That is air, land, fresh water, atmosphere and climate. And noting that our climate change reporting is covered elsewhere as well, but aspects of the climate such as particulates in the air, in which we've heard recently a very interesting report from the Parliamentary Commissioner of the Environment, which actually demonstrates the need to have legislation of this sort which will future-proof. There's no point in locking in a reporting regime which is based on old science, which is based on the old levels of particulates, given we know now that when it comes to either dust from building sites or particulates that may come out of the petrochemical industry, emissions from our vehicles, fireplaces, etc., it's the very small, nano-sized particles which are actually the most dangerous to human health and most injurious to the environment. So that's just one small example of how science has evolved, and why we need legislation which is future-proofed and will give us some assurance into the future that we can report in a sensible fashion, in a useful way, but also in a cost-effective way, given the significant investment of taxpayers' money that goes into commissioning any of the reports in these areas. So, Sir, I'd like to turn now to some of the definitions we've actually used, because I think this is quite pertinent, so that we know we are getting reports on these 5 domains on a 6-monthly rotational basis that will be useful. The air domain, the clean air that we value in this country, that means the domain surrounding the Earth composed of gases, vapours and particulates. Now, we've heard some gases and vapours from the other side of the House, but those that we're concerned about on this side are the variety that make our environment good and healthy to live in, so that we can breathe clean air, and so that our species that depend on levels of gases and vapours as they are now can continue to survive, given recent reporting around some of the scientific challenges that those species faced in terms of climate change. The biodiversity that we are talking about is the living organisms and ecological complexes. So these are very broad categories. They're broadly defined. We're not talking merely about individual animals, but we're talking about diversity within species and the relationships between groups of species and their ecosystems. In terms of the climate, we're talking about meteorological conditions and variations, solar radiation, temperature levels, humidity, clouds, precipitations, atmospheric pressure, and wind. So these environmental conditions that can be impacted upon by human activity, and I, for one, am by no means a denier of climate change being an anthropogenic factor. That is something that human activity has influenced. It's important that we keep that broad definition here in that regard. In terms of the freshwater domain, we're talking not only about the physical water, the rivers, but all the animals, vegetation and structures associated with our rivers. And so far in the last few weeks on the committee, the Local Government Environment Committee, we've heard about the long-fin eel and the challenges, the tuna, as Māori might call it, the challenges that we face in accurately measuring but also understanding where that population of important creatures, which Māori regard as a taonga, not simply as a source of food or as an interesting feature to put in an aquarium, but actually as a treasure of their people, to make sure that they are preserved and protected. So that's just one example, again, of the sorts of domain reporting that would be useful, rather than having officials launch off into new and interesting and innovative areas at great expense to the public purse. Sir, one area that my colleague Nuk Karako may address later, but I just wanted to perhaps presage before he got onto it, was the amendment that the committee has suggested to the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiritio Waitangi clause. That's clause 4A in the bill. So we have suggested a change there to take into appropriate account Treaty of Waitangi, and to provide for Te Ao Māori to be an impact category when we're preparing the synthesis and domain reports, and to ensure the reports are informed by a Māori perspective. That's something that we on this side of the House do consider to be important, not because I think there was a rather spurious contribution before about how Māori perhaps were better stewards or guardians of the environment. I actually, as a person of Ngāi Tahu ki Whangaroa descent, I'm not entirely sure that we can talk about being better or worse, but I can say that we have perhaps different perceptions among Māori and other New Zealanders as to the meaning and the importance and the ways to manage the environment better. So for that reason, sir, I'm happy to see that we have under section 4AB, required consultation with iwi authorities before regulations pursuant to this legislation are made. So I think that's a positive change and a useful amendment, and evidence that the committee has worked hard on this and come up with some useful contributions. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Eugenie Sage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tēnā koe, and congratulations.